Hey there, do you need another last-minute Christmas idea besides the PREPSTEADERS calendar? I want to share with you a phenomenal recipe for banana bread, but this just isn't any banana bread. This is scrumptious, sealed in a mason jar banana bread. So it's perfect for giving as Christmas gifts. It's absolutely delicious, and it's lengthened in its shelf-stable lifespan. So I'll see you around the corner. All right, to get started on this amazing recipe, you're going to, of course, want to set your oven so it's heating up already. And I have mine set at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. If that's Celsius for you, I think it's somewhere around the 177 mark. Okay, get that warming up. And next, you're going to want to get your jars out. You'll want to choose jars that do not have any shoulders. I like these. There's also a version of Weck jars that is wonderful that has no shoulders, or you can get the really tall version that's skinnier than this. Those work great. Just make sure there's literally no shoulder, because remember, you've got to dump the bread out at the end and it can't get stuck. So no amount of shoulder is going to be any good for you. You want it perfectly straight. I'm going to take these. I've got 8 of them for this recipe, and I'm just going to coat them lightly on the inside with oil. You could use coconut oil or just a stick of butter to get that going. Some people like to also flour them. I'm going to say that's unnecessary and it doesn't make them as pretty. So I just put some oil in the inside of those 8 jars, set them aside, and they'll be ready when we're ready to pour in our batter. Next, if you have your grandmother's apron, put it on if you haven't already. You'll be glad you did. And if you've got her blender, the one with the short in the cord, you'll want to use that too. This recipe really works well with a blender, though you could do it by hand. It's really hard to get that whipped butter that we're going to do next. So once we've got our blender out and a big bowl, and we'll need a second bowl later, but we're going to start in this big bowl with 3/4 of a cup of butter. We're going to want to whip just together, before anything else, the sugar and the butter. Now, I've put the butter in already. The sugar I use, you can use whichever kind you want, but I particularly am fond of this Morena pure sugar. It's all natural and unbleached, and it also doesn't have the bone char in it, if you're familiar with that. So we're going to put in 2 3/4 of a cup of sugar, and then just whip this all together until it's really light and fluffy. So I've put 2 in, there's a 1/2 of a cup, and here's our last 1/4 of a cup to finish out the 2 3/4 cups needed. All right, let's whip that up. All right, I've got it light and fluffy like it asks for me to. And now we're going to add the eggs. And I'll tell you this, for our recipe, I'm going to use 5 small eggs because I didn't have the 4 large eggs that it calls for. You do what you need to. It calls for 4 large eggs. I'm going to have 5 small eggs because that's all I have to work with from the chickens. We're going to put them in one at a time and then just incorporate them by blending it further. You don't have to whip them completely, but make sure they're each stirred in well before you add the next one. So here we go. All right, we've got it all creamy and whipped up in that perfect consistency. And grandmother's blender with the cord that has the short in it did just fine doing the job for us. Now, the reason I love this is because after a full year of letting them accumulate, the bananas that I didn't dehydrate quick enough or eat quick enough or do anything with, they ended up in the freezer. And so this is their time to shine. Once the bananas that you have turned brown, you probably know this already, but that sugar content in them really comes out. And that's why it's better to use brown old bananas that are kind of over the hill for eating the way that they are. Right now they're sweeter than that, and that's the way we want them. For this recipe, we're going to use about 2.5 cups worth, and that's going to vary depending on how large or small your bananas are. Generally 2 cups is about 6 bananas that are medium small sized. So we want 2.5 cups for this recipe. I'm going to use 8 of these bananas and see if that doesn't do the job for us. So you've got this ready. You're just going to put the bananas right in there. They don't have to be added one at a time. We're just going to get them all in there and get it all stirred up together. All right, we've got that well incorporated. Those bananas went in nicely because I had taken them out of the freezer and let them get semi thawed out. You probably noticed that as I peeled them. It makes them easier if they're not completely thawed, because then they're just complete mush. But you don't want them completely frozen either. Then you wouldn't be able to get the skins off easily. So keep that in mind. I've got them put in and they blended up nicely. Here's the last part of this that we add that is a liquid ingredient before we put the flour in. And this is where you get to be a little bit creative as well. The recipe is going to call for 3/4 cup of water. However, based on what you've already put in, if you seem to think it's just extra runny already, if it's just very runny, you can go ahead and take a tablespoon or so of that water out. Don't stress about it. It's going to be very forgiving, but it does call for 3/4 cup of water. Now, this is where I like to get a little bit creative, because that homemade vanilla that we made a while back, it's now Christmas time and it's ready for us to use it. So I'm going to take out a teaspoon of this 3/4 cup of water. I'm just going to reach in with a teaspoon and take out, so I'm displacing the water, if that makes sense to you. I'm going to just scoop out a teaspoon, and I'm going to add a teaspoon of my own homemade vanilla. And because I love almond extract so much, especially in banana bread, I'm going to do it a second time and add a teaspoon of almond. So just for the record, I'm taking out 2 teaspoons of water. I'm adding to this a teaspoon of my homemade vanilla and a teaspoon of almond extract. That's completely optional. It's just my favorite way to take it up a notch. All right, that's the last we're going to need. Grandmother's good blender that helped us through this, and that is all of our wet ingredients. So I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to get a clean and new bowl, and we're just going to mix all the dry ingredients together before we add them to this to ultimately stir it into the final product. Here we go. For this, I love to use King Arthur, but you could use gold medal or any kind of good all-purpose flour. Just make sure it's all-purpose and not like self-rising or something like that. We're going to put in 3.5 cups of all-purpose flour, and then we're going to add the yummies to this, like the cinnamon and cloves that are going to make it have such a delicious, rich taste. To that flour, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of baking powder and 2 teaspoons of baking soda. Not to be confused, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 2 teaspoons of baking soda. Next, we're going to want 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And because I only had the kind that was in rock salt form, I went ahead and ground it up into this little cup. And you just want to measure out 1.5 teaspoons and throw it in there together. Before we stir this all together, I'm going to add 1 rounded teaspoon of cloves. It only calls for 1 teaspoon, but I'm always a little bit extravagant with my cloves and cinnamon. And it calls for 2 rounded or 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. Of course, if you can get Saigon cinnamon or Ceylon cinnamon, I don't know for sure how you pronounce that, but that's going to be the way more delicious than just the regular cinnamon that you'd get in the aisle at the grocery store. Now we're going to just get this all stirred up so that it's well incorporated before we put it in with the other. And just so you know, the next thing, once we add these all together and stir them up, the last ingredient is optional, and that's chopped pecans. You'll add that once we get this all incorporated, but I just want you to know that if you are someone who is allergic to nuts or you just don't like the taste of pecans, you can just leave that part out. Some folks that are very particular like to sift this all together with an actual sifter, because then it's very fluffy and light, has lots of air to it, and is well incorporated. I usually just stir it up. All right, let's get these poured together. By the time you get to this stage in the recipe, you'll be very thankful you started with a very large bowl over here, because now it's time to pour this in, and you'll notice we're going to really use every bit of that bowl. But let's get this all poured together, and we'll just stir it up with this. We don't need a blender or anything like that. You only need to incorporate this. It does not have to be extremely whipped or beaten together or anything like that. I'm just going to turn it and stir it until we don't have any more flour showing. The nice thing about this recipe is that literally you can make canned bread with any number of cakes like this. Like zucchini bread is one of my other favorites that you can do this with. And it's going to last, depending on who you ask, as short as a week, because you're going to want to eat it, or as long as a year. And I will promise you I have tried it at over a year. In fact, I tried it last Christmas. I found some that had been in the back of the pantry for 4 years. And yes, it was over the hill. But it didn't kill me. It didn't make me sick or anything like that. It just didn't taste good at all. And I quickly threw it out. But I was curious, and I had to at least try it. Some folks are very concerned because when we call this canned bread, the concern is that you would treat it like other canned goods that are almost indefinitely shelf stable. This is not that kind of canning. This is a canning that's going to seal up nicely and be perfect for gifts and even be shelf stable for a while, but only perhaps for about 4 months on the shelf. Now, if you put it in the refrigerator, canned like that, it can last up to a year. But the way we're making it, I'm going to say, personally, I would keep it either in the refrigerator for up to a year or give it to folks and tell them that you recommend that they use it within 4 months of when you have given it to them. All right, let's stir in some pecans. This recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup, but you can add as much as 1 cup of pecans, and it should be very happy with that. I think I'm somewhere right there in between today, but we're going to stir those in, and we'll be ready to put this in the jars. I want to give you a little secret that's going to help with the success of these. It's not mandatory, but I think it really does make a difference. What you're going to want to do is take the bottom shelf of your oven and put it down as low as you can get it, all right? And then find some kind of a baking pan, and I'm going to put about a cup of water in here and then set that in on that bottom shelf. Then just above it, I'm going to put the next shelf. So with this in the bottom, with the water coming up, it's going to help these glass jars to handle the heat, first of all, and it's going to help the cake that's in them, the banana bread, to rise a little bit higher. These were actually made for water bath canning or pressure canning. So they thrive best, or whatever you want to, they survive best in a wet environment. So that bit of water we're putting in the bottom of the oven is going to help. However, I don't set them into this tray. I just set this tray of water in the bottom of the oven, and then I've got a big cookie sheet, and I'm going to fill them up and set them on the cookie sheet on that next layer above this. Here we go. These are ready to be filled now, and they have been sprayed just on the inside with that coconut oil spray. So it does look white, but I did not put any flour in these. I like the oil spray to just kind of turn transparent so that you see the pretty bread in there. And then if you've got one of these from your canning supplies, this is fantastic. A big funnel that's going to make it a lot less messy, though there's no way to make it impossibly unmessy. We're going to fill each of these just half full. Promise me you remember that, because if you fill it over that, I can't promise that they're not going to come over the top. You need to just have them half full. If any of them have something on the rim, I make sure I've wiped that off, and we'll wipe it again at the end. And we're setting them about an inch apart so they have plenty of room between them to breathe. Gets the heat all the way around them. I actually had enough for just over the 8 jars that I planned. Never try to bake them with the lid on. They need to have it off. All right, we're ready to put them in. Again, I'm putting them on 350. I'm putting them on that rack on top of a cookie sheet, but the rack below has a pan full of at least a cup full of water that's going to evaporate through this process. We're going to give them anywhere between 35 and 45 minutes. So watch them close. If I were you, I would set the timer for probably 35 minutes and then just check them after that. Just as you would regular banana bread. You're wanting to have that nice rounded top that's just a little bit golden. And when you put a toothpick in it, you want it to come out pretty clean. You'll know that that's when they're done. Now, while that 35-minute timer is ticking, you're going to stay busy because you've got 2 assignments. The first one is, if you're going to decorate these at the end, you'll want to already find some pretty muslin or cotton fabric that just is perfect for the season. Cut it into little squares or circles, whatever you like, and I'm cutting just the right length of ribbon here to decorate each of them as they come out. Once I've got those all finished, I'm going to make sure that the lids are ready so that when they come out of the oven, I've got the lids already sterilized and heated up. So we're preparing them ahead of time, and it looks to me like our breads are done. So as we get these pulled out of here and put up on the counter, I'm going to set them all out first, but work quickly now. Set them all out. You're going to quickly run a wet washcloth around each of the rims of those jars so that they're all extremely clean. And then take one of those heated lids, dry it, make sure it isn't wet still from that water, and pop it on the top. So each one of these needs to have their own lid. Go ahead and put the rings on them afterward and tighten those down, at least finger tight. And then we're going to just let them set. Our hard work is done. You can take a breather. You're going to wait for that popping sound. We don't decorate them until they're fully cooled because you want to make sure that they've sucked that lid in and have a nice good seal before you decorate the top and give these as gifts. This batch came out at just a little over that 8 jar mark that I mentioned earlier. I thought it would make 8 pint jars. Well, this actually was 8.5. So I've cut one of them, that smallest little smidgen of a jar I cut, and it made perfectly 3 pieces I wanted to show you, and we'll taste test here in a minute. But let me make sure you know this. Don't ever err on the side of letting it be too soft. Even if you love normally gooey bread, this is one that you want to make sure if it's going to stay in a sealed can, it needs to be fully done. So that toothpick test that your grandma gave you to do on breads when you were young, that's going to come into play here. Make sure it fully passes that toothpick test of not coming out with any of that batter still left uncooked on it. That's one thing I want you to remember. Also know that you can make this with any different kind of that dessert table bread recipe, not the yeast breads like you're used to, but zucchini bread or pineapple bread. Some of you love to make cranberry orange bread this time of year, or the same type of bread that makes the blueberry muffins. You could make a blueberry bread like this. This is what it's going to look like when it's done, and it'll be that nice golden brown, and you can see around the edges how it's kind of goldenly around. It is super moist though. This is not overdone at all. It pulls away from the walls and comes out very easily when you just dump it upside down, as long as you don't have shoulders on your jar, because that will just mess it all up. But this will just slide right out. You'll put just a little bit of fresh butter on it, or that clarified butter or ghee that you have that we've made before. My mouth is watering thinking about this. I hope that you will make some. It will be a quick way to make phenomenal gifts that everyone will love. It does take about 30 to 40 minutes before you start hearing those lids pop in and tell you that it's finished. And that's when you know you've got a good seal. If in doubt, you can always take the ring off the top of the jar and just kind of hold it with your fingers. Suspend it from its cap just to make sure that it's sealed well. You'll also see a nice concave indentation in the top telling you that it's sealed well. Don't give them away anything different than that. Remember, this is going to last up to 4 months in the refrigerator. I've personally had it last up to a year with no problem. But if it starts to smell different or have a different color come into it, or you open it and have any doubts, don't worry, you can just throw it away. But because this is not a high acid food that does well in canning, and because it has such a high moisture content, it does have a tendency to not last much longer than a year, even if you've canned it very well. So give it to friends. Make sure you've marked the date that you have made that so that they know what is going to be safe for them to keep and enjoy it. That's all I have for you. I hope you go out and have the most wonderful Christmas. I hope that you join us back again next year for some fantastic episodes of PREPSTEADERS. We've already got several in the lineup that you're going to just love, and we can't wait to see you in 2021. So until I see you then, go out, find someone to be a blessing to today, and we'll see you next year. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Oh, it's all about God this morning. It's all about God today. It's all about God this evening. It's all about God always. My Bible says God loves me, can take away my sin, but I'll never see heaven if I don't trust in Him. Oh, it's all about God this morning. It's all about God today. It's all about God this evening. It's all about God always. Satan means to do me harm, and tempted I may be, but Christ lends me His loving arms, and He said He'd walk with me. If you are in trouble, your load you need to share. You've never had a burden my Lord would not help you bear. Oh, it's all about God this morning. It's all about God today. It's all about God this evening. It's all about God always. Oh, it's all about God always.